I've just been sitting in the plenary hall, and as I was sitting there, I saw Yvo de Boer walk out with his hands in his pockets, looking very disconsolate. And of course, he's been sitting through these for 14 years now as a negotiator, and then as executive of the UNFCCC. And the progress is so slow and so kind of incremental. I can understand why he would feel exhausted by it. But how long can the process cope with this slow progress before people are going to start to say maybe other avenues are the answer?
Well, unfortunately, it's an issue of global governance, and the only mechanism we have for the entire world to come to an agreement on something as important as this is the UN, and that has 192 countries, so it's inevitably slow. Ivo's been at this for 14 years. I think today may well be his last day of negotiation, so he's maybe in a sense burnt out on this. But the process needs to continue. It will continue. People can only do this as individuals for so long. It's one of the reasons why I'm also not going to be involved so much in negotiations anymore. I've been doing it for not as long as Ivo, but for quite a long time. Not negotiating, but following the negotiations, which is slightly less frustrating than actually negotiating.
And you mentioned you're not going to be doing it anymore. I know you've got a new initiative in Bangladesh. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I'm moving on to relocate back to Bangladesh. I'm originally Bangladeshi, but I've been living in London in the UK for the last 10 years, working for the International Institute for Environment and Development. And we're setting up, in fact, my institute, IIED, is a joint venture with a university in Bangladesh, a new international center for climate change and development, where we focus on capacity building through training, short courses for different people, and then a master's degree program on climate change and development starting next year. This is very much in response to the growing demand. I think one of the positive outcomes for developing countries in particular from Copenhagen is that climate change became a very major issue. All their heads of state went to Copenhagen. Even if they didn't do very much there, they came back feeling this is important, we need to do something. So we have a much higher political priority being given to climate change in these countries, a lot more people engaging with the issue, and that generates a demand for capacity building. It's a new issue, people don't know much about it, they want to know, what's this all about and what's it got to do with me, whoever me is, NGO, civil society, businessman, government official, they're all wanting capacity building to be done. You hear it here in a lot of the interventions as a primary demand from developing countries. So it's in order to meet that, not entirely, but to have try and address that. We're setting the center up in Bangladesh, but not just for Bangladesh, it'll be for other developing countries as well. We bring people to Bangladesh to train, and then they can see what's happening, because there's quite a lot of stuff happening in Bangladesh, which is also quite interesting.
It's an interesting issue, but to what extent are developing countries actively seeking to begin adaptation programs and start to resolve some of the issues that are raised by climate change?
Well, I think that's the good news. I think in many of the developing countries, until very recently, they used to think of this as a global problem that had to be solved at the global level first, and then we'll start tackling it at home. They've realized that they just can't afford to wait for that, and many of them are doing various different things and very interesting variety of things. And as I said, Bangladesh is probably not way ahead, but a step or two ahead of the others in terms of realizing this is a big problem, putting about $100 million of its own resources into implementing a climate change strategy, inviting donors to contribute to it, getting government and non-governmental actors involved in implementing things. So there's a lot of stuff happening there that others can then learn from as well. And that's one of the reasons why we're locating our center there as a leading center that can share that knowledge and information with other developing countries.
Well, some positive news on the adaptation front, at least then. I guess just before I'm going to hand back to the studio in London, mitigation seems to be a little bit less positive, and we've spoken about these kind of the small steps forward. Yvo de Boer said earlier in the week that he couldn't see satisfactory mitigation targets for the next decade. How would you react to that statement, and where does that leave us in relation to hopes for Cancun and South Africa even?
I think the mitigation targets are a much bigger challenge, and we shouldn't raise our hopes for Cancun on them either. I agree with him. I think they're several years away from resolution. What we are likely to, the incremental positive step is that the United States is showing that they're willing to take action. Large developing countries like China and India are showing that they're willing to take action. And a lot of these actions are now, as with adaptation, happening at the domestic level. So these countries are actually engaging on how are they going to do it, which is a good sign. And it'll take a few years before they come back to the international arena and say, all right, now we're willing to take on ambitious global targets to reduce our emissions. And that's really what we need. My own view is that I wouldn't say a decade, I'd say 2015 might be a good milestone year to think about for two reasons. Firstly, the IPCC is just starting its 5th assessment report, which is due out in 2014. And I think that'll make a huge difference in terms of our knowledge of what's really happening by that time. And we'll be able to piggyback off the 5th assessment like we did Bali Action Plan off the 4th assessment. And secondly, during this time, we will find countries actually putting in place measures that they feel are the right things to do, and that they will continue to do that. And an interesting debate is in the European Union, which came to Copenhagen with a 20% unilateral reduction target, which they were prepared to go to 30% if everybody else did. Nobody else did, so they never went to 30%. But the debate is going on internally now. Why don't we go to 30% unilaterally ourselves? It's the right thing to do. We can do it. It might cost a bit of money to start with, but in the long run, it's good for us. And you have a very interesting debate going on in the European Union right now on going unilaterally to a 30% target. Because it's the right thing to do, not because somebody else tells them they have to do it or some global agreement says they have to do it. And once we get that dynamic of countries going into a low carbon pathways in order to be ahead of the game in the future, looking at a future as a low carbon future, then we'll have a much more positive dynamic of people wanting to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do and it's good for them, rather than because of some global agreement and everybody else has to agree before we agree.
And you've said 2015 is the year we should be looking at. That's also the year that many organisations are saying emissions need to peak. Is it soon enough?
It's not soon enough. I mean, we're going to overshoot. But another reason why 2015 is critical in the negotiating arena is that in the Copenhagen Accord, one of the last paragraphs, if not the last paragraph, which was at the insistence of the AOSIS countries, particularly President Nasheed of Maldives, actually has a review of the temperature target of 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees, which is what AOSIS and the small islands have been calling for, in 2015. So even though it may seem unlikely, we can re-examine those targets in 2015 in this process, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. And then if the situation demands much more drastic cuts, I think countries will be more amenable to making those more drastic cuts that would be needed.
Okay, well, it looks like campaigners and activists are going to have to be in it for the long haul then. Saleem, thank you very much for joining us. It's been great speaking to you this week, and I'll hand back to the studio in London.